November 28, 1944. A single American submarine is about to sink the largest warship ever destroyed by a sub in human history. 71,000 tons of steel, the pride of Japan's Navy, gone in less than 7 hours. But here's the insane part. The ship that went down was practically unsinkable, designed with armor thick enough to shrug off torpedoes, escorted by 3 destroyers carrying over 2,500 souls. And the man who took her down, Commander Joseph Enright, a submarine captain who had failed so badly the year before that he voluntarily stepped down from command, doubting his own judgment. Now he's back for redemption. One shot, one night, one impossible kill. This is the story of how the largest aircraft carrier ever built lasted just 10 days before vanishing into the dark Pacific, and how a disgraced captain became a legend. By late 1944, the Pacific War had reached a turning point, but not the one Japan had hoped for. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the most feared maritime force in Asia, was hemorrhaging ships, planes, and trained pilots at an unsustainable rate. The catastrophic defeat at Midway in June 1942 had ripped the heart out of Japan's carrier striking power. 4 frontline carriers, Akagi Kaga Soryu and Hiryu, vanished in a single day, taking with them hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew. 2 years later, the situation had only worsened. American submarines prowled the Pacific like wolves, cutting Japan's supply lines and hunting her warships with ruthless efficiency. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies never made it home. Troop transports went to the bottom. Destroyers that once escorted convoys now became targets themselves. Japan's merchant fleet was being systematically destroyed, and with it, the empire's ability to wage war. The Navy was desperate. They needed a miracle, a weapon so powerful it could turn the tide, restore confidence, and prove to the Allies that Japan was far from defeated. That weapon had a name: Shinano. Originally laid down in May 1940, as the 3rd Yamato-class super battleship, Shinano was intended to be an unstoppable floating fortress, armed with 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. But Midway changed everything. With Japan's carrier fleet gutted, the Imperial Navy made a radical decision: convert the unfinished battleship hull into an aircraft carrier. It was a desperate gamble, a complete redesign mid-construction. The keel was already laid. The hull was halfway complete. Engineers scrambled to rip out gun turrets and install a flight deck instead. The Shinano would become the largest aircraft carrier ever built, stretching over 872 feet long, nearly 3 football fields from bow to stern. Her displacement reached 71,000 metric tons, dwarfing even the American Essex-class carriers. She could theoretically carry over 160 aircraft, a staggering number, meant to overwhelm any enemy task force. Her top speed was rated at 27 knots, roughly 31 miles per hour, with a range of 10,000 nautical miles, enough to strike deep into Allied-controlled waters and return. Below the waterline, massive anti-torpedo bulges were installed, designed to absorb the shock of underwater explosions. Her armor belt, originally planned at 16 inches thick, was reduced to just 6 inches to speed up construction. It was a compromise, one that would prove fatal. But in November 1944, standing at the Yokosuka naval shipyard, Shinano looked invincible. On November 19, 1944, the shipyard was alive with celebration. Flags snapped in the wind. Military bands played stirring marches. Officers in crisp white uniforms stood at attention as the massive aircraft carrier was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. For a brief moment, hope flickered. This was the ship that would restore Japan's dominance. This was the symbol of the empire's resilience. And then everything changed. High above, cutting through the clouds, an American B-29 Superfortress reconnaissance plane appeared. Its cameras clicked. One photograph, one image. And suddenly, Shinano's secret was out. Panic rippled through Tokyo. If the Americans knew about Shinano, an air raid was inevitable. B-29s could strike from Saipan, newly captured by the Allies, and level the shipyard before the carrier even left port. The order came down immediately: get Shinano out of Tokyo. Now. Standing on the bridge of the enormous ship was Captain Toshio Abe, a quiet, methodical officer who had spent his career in the Navy's torpedo school far from the front lines. He was not a famous admiral. He was not a war hero. He was a capable, by the book commander suddenly handed the most important mission in the Imperial Navy deliver Shinano safely to Kure Naval Base, 300 miles south, where she could be finished armed and made ready for combat. But Captain Abe knew something his superiors did not want to hear. Shinano was not ready to sail. Watertight doors were missing. Bulkhead openings for electrical cables were unsealed. The fire suppression system was incomplete. The bilge pumps critical for removing water from flooding compartments were not fully operational. Abe protested. He begged for more time. But the Navy General Staff refused. The risk of an air raid was too great. Shinano had to leave immediately, ready or not. And so at 5:00 p.m. on November 28, 1944, the largest aircraft carrier ever built slipped from her moorings and began her maiden voyage, a voyage that should have taken 16 hours. She would not survive the night. Escorting her were 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze, all experienced warships with combat records. Aboard Shinano were 2,000 officers and crew, along with 300 shipyard workers still welding wiring and frantically finishing construction as the ship sailed. There were also 40 civilian contractors and a group of conscripted Korean laborers, none of whom spoke Japanese fluently, a communication disaster waiting to happen. Below deck, Shinano carried a grim cargo, 6 Shinyo suicide boats, essentially manned torpedoes, and 50 Oka rocket-powered kamikaze planes. Japan was betting everything on desperation weapons now. Captain Abe had wanted a daylight passage. It would give him time to train his inexperienced crew, time to test the ship's systems. But he was ordered to sail at night. The Navy could not provide air cover, and a daylight run would make Shinano an easy target for American patrol planes. So, into the darkness, she went running on just 8 of her 12 boilers. 4 were offline, limiting her speed to 18 knots instead of her design 27. Still, the journey to Kure was expected to be routine. Just 16 hours. What could go wrong? Everything. Because 200 miles to the south, beneath the black waters of the Pacific, the USS Archerfish was waiting. Commander Joseph Enright stood on the conning tower of his submarine scanning the moonlit horizon. He was a man haunted by failure. Just 1 year earlier, in November 1943, Enright had been in command of another submarine when he encountered the Japanese aircraft carrier Shokaku, one of the carriers that had launched planes during the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had a shot, a clear shot, but Enright hesitated, second-guessing his firing solution, doubting the math. Shokaku escaped. Enright was devastated. The guilt ate at him. He voluntarily stepped down from command, telling his superiors he was not fit to lead. It was an extraordinary admission, a career-ending move. Most officers would have covered up the mistake, blamed equipment, blamed weather. But Enright blamed himself. For months, he wondered if he would ever command again. And then, in late 1944, the Navy gave him a second chance. A new submarine, a new crew. One more shot at redemption. Enright vowed he would not fail again. At 8:50 p.m. on November 28th, the radar operator aboard Archerfish called out a contact. Something big, 14 miles to the northeast. Enright grabbed his binoculars and climbed to the bridge. At first, through the darkness, the shape was unclear. Maybe an oil tanker with escorts. But as the silhouette grew sharper under the full moon, Enright's heart raced. This was no tanker. It was an aircraft carrier. Massive. Larger than anything he had ever seen. Breaking standard protocol, Enright ordered continuous radar pings to track the target, knowing full well it would alert the Japanese to his presence. He did not care. This was his shot. He was not going to lose another carrier. The Archerfish turned to intercept, running on the surface at full throttle, engines roaring, pushing 18 knots. To keep pace with the carrier, they had to stay surfaced. Submerged, they would be too slow. The chase was on. Aboard Shinano, the radar operators immediately detected the American submarine's transmissions. Captain Abe was informed. One submarine. He was not worried. One submarine could not threaten a ship as large as Shinano. It would take a coordinated wolfpack attack, multiple subs firing simultaneously, to bring down a vessel this size. Just a month earlier, it had taken 19 torpedoes and countless bombs over 2 days to sink Shinano's sister ship, Musashi, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. One submarine was a nuisance, nothing more. At 10:45 p.m., lookouts spotted the Archerfish on the surface. The destroyer Isokaze, disobeying orders, broke formation and moved to attack. Captain Abe immediately ordered the destroyer back. He suspected a trap. The American sub was bait, trying to lure his escorts away so other submarines could strike Shinano from a different angle. Abe was certain he was facing a wolf pack. So instead of engaging, he ordered a sharp turn to the south, confident that Shinano's superior speed would allow them to simply outrun the pursuer. By his calculations, Shinano had a 1 to 2 knot advantage. The American submarine would fall behind, and by dawn, they would be safe. But Enright did not fall behind. The Archerfish strained at maximum speed, black smoke pouring from her diesels as she raced to keep the massive carrier in sight. At 11:00 p.m., visual contact was lost. The Shinano had pulled ahead, disappearing into the night. Enright's crew looked at each other, frustration written on their faces. Not again. But Enright did not give up. He made a gamble. The carrier had been heading southwest when he lost visual contact. If the captain turned back to his original course, heading west toward Kuri, Enright could cut across and intercept. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. So he stayed the course, praying his guess was right, fingering the rosary beads in his pocket, waiting. Minutes crawled by. Then at 11:22 p.m., fate intervened. Deep inside Shinano's engine room, one of the propeller shafts began to overheat. The ship had been running hard, and the machinery was not fully tested. Captain Abe had no choice. He reduced speed to 18 knots to prevent a catastrophic breakdown. Suddenly, the speed advantage was gone. Shinano and Archerfish were now matched, both running at 18 knots. And then, at 11:40 p.m., Captain Abe made the decision that would doom his ship. Believing he had successfully evaded the submarine, confident that he was safe, he ordered a course change. Shinano turned due west, resuming her original heading toward Kuri. Exactly as Enright had predicted. Aboard the Archerfish, the radar operator suddenly shouted. Contact regained. The carrier was back on the scope now, just ahead of them, moving west. Enright could barely believe it. His gamble had paid off. The chase was back on. From here, it became a desperate race. Shinano's zigzag pattern, designed to make her harder to target, gave Archerfish the opportunity to slowly pull ahead. Inch by inch, mile by mile, the American submarine crept closer, angling for a firing position. Enright was exhausted, drenched in sweat, but he could not afford to rest. At 2:00 a.m., knowing other American submarines might be in the area, Enright transmitted a contact report to Pearl Harbor, giving his position and intended target. The Japanese intercepted the transmission immediately. On Shinano's bridge, Captain Abe listened to the foreign signal and felt his worst fears confirmed. It was not one submarine. It was a wolf pack. They were surrounded. The Americans were coordinating an attack. But Abe had no way to determine the exact location of the submarines. Shinano's hastily installed equipment could intercept signals but could not triangulate their source. He imagined enemies to the north waiting to ambush. So at 2:56 a.m., terrified of sailing into a trap, Captain Abe made another turn, swinging southwest, back onto the original 210-degree course. He had just turned directly toward the Archerfish. Enright saw the carrier's heading change and could not believe his luck. The target was now steaming straight at him. At 3:05 a.m., he gave the order. Take her down. The Archerfish dove leveling off at 60 feet below the surface, gliding silently into attack position. Enright stared through the periscope. The massive carrier filled his view, growing larger with every second. Flood the tubes, he ordered. Set torpedo depth to 10 feet. The crew hesitated. 10 feet was extremely shallow. Most submarine commanders set torpedoes to run at 20 or 30 feet to ensure they hit below the waterline. But Enright remembered advice from Rear Admiral Freeland Dobbin: if you are going after a carrier hit just beneath the waterline, the weight of the flight deck will do more damage than hitting deep. The top-heavy design of carriers made them vulnerable to shallow hits. The ship would roll. Enright also knew his Mark 14 torpedoes had a reputation for running deeper than their settings. So 10 feet on the dial meant they would actually run at 12 or 15 feet. Perfect. Aboard Shinano, something changed. For hours they had heard the steady radar pings from the American submarine. Now suddenly, silence. Captain Abe knew exactly what that meant. The submarine had submerged. An attack was imminent. He ordered another frantic turn this time, heading due south, trying desperately to evade. But it was too late. Abe had turned his ship broadside, presenting the largest possible target. By 3:13 a.m., the range had closed to just under 2 miles. The Archerfish crept forward, threading through the destroyer screen. One destroyer passed directly overhead, just 10 feet above the submarine's hull, its propellers churning the water into a violent froth. The Americans held their breath. But the destroyer's sonar was damaged from a previous battle. She sailed past blind. Enright raised the periscope one final time. Shinano loomed enormous in the lens, her massive hull silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Fire 1. The firing plunger slammed down. A compressed air charge ejected the torpedo from the tube. 8 seconds later, Fire 2, then Fire 3. Fire 4. 4 torpedoes launched in rapid succession, racing through the water at 46 knots. The crew reloaded frantically. Fire 5. Fire 6. 6 torpedoes total, streaking toward the largest carrier ever built. Enright kept his eye glued to the periscope, counting seconds. And then impact. 2 brilliant flashes erupted along Shinano's starboard side, lighting up the night like lightning. The deck shuddered beneath Enright's feet. Take her down. 400 feet. Rig for depth charge, he shouted. The Archerfish dove hard, escaping into the black depths as 2 more torpedoes slammed into the carrier above. 4 hits, 4 massive explosions. And in those 4 explosions, the fate of the largest aircraft carrier ever built was sealed. But Captain Abe did not know that yet. Standing on Shinano's bridge, he felt the impacts, heard the alarms, saw the lights flicker. Damage reports flooded in. 4 torpedo hits starboard side. But Abe remained calm. This was what Shinano was designed for. Her anti-torpedo bulges her armor her size. 4 torpedoes should not be enough. The Musashi had taken 19. Surely Shinano could survive 4. But then he looked out the forward windows and saw something that made his blood run cold. The horizon was tilted. Shinano was already listing, and it was getting worse. 4 torpedoes. 4 hits. The largest aircraft carrier ever built is listing in the darkness. Captain Abe stands frozen on the bridge, watching the horizon tilt at an impossible angle. Below deck, seawater roars through torn bulkheads. The damage control teams scramble, but they are fighting a losing battle. Shinano was supposed to be unsinkable. She was supposed to survive anything the Americans could throw at her. But now, with watertight doors missing and fire suppression systems offline, the monster of steel is bleeding to death. The clock is ticking. 7 hours. That is all she has left. And 200 feet below, Commander Enright's submarine slips into the black depths, her crew already celebrating their impossible kill. But the real horror has only just begun. Because as dawn breaks over the Pacific, 2 515 souls aboard Shinano are about to discover that their floating fortress is actually their tomb. The first torpedo struck at 3:17 a.m. It tore open an empty fuel tank on the starboard side, flooding it instantly. Not catastrophic. The second hit came 8 seconds later, ripping into the starboard engine room. Water surged in with the force of a tidal wave, drowning the machinery and killing the power to half the ship. Still survivable. The third torpedo obliterated fire room number 3, killing every man inside before they could even scream. The compartment flooded in seconds, water spilling across into adjacent rooms. The fourth punched through the starboard air compressor room, disabling damage control station number 2. And that was when Captain Abe realized the terrible truth. Each torpedo had struck high just beneath the waterline, exactly where Shinano's armor was weakest. The 6-inch belt could not stop them. Worse, every hit had been shallow, targeting the upper hull, where critical systems were located. The Americans had known exactly where to aim. Within minutes, damage reports flooded the bridge. Fire Room 1 flooding, Fire Room 7 flooding, refrigeration plant destroyed, starboard engine room, total loss. The numbers kept coming, each one worse than the last. By 3:45 a.m., 30 minutes after the attack, Shinano had a 13-degree list to starboard. Captain Abe gripped the bridge rail, his knuckles white. The ship was dying, and he knew why. The watertight doors were missing. The bulkhead openings for electrical cables were unsealed. The fire suppression mains were incomplete. The bilge pumps designed to remove thousands of gallons of water per minute were not fully operational. Everything Abe had warned about, everything he had begged his superiors to fix before sailing, was now coming back to destroy them. The ship was not ready. She should never have left port. But orders were orders. And now 2,515 people were paying the price for bureaucratic impatience. Abe gave the order that would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. Full speed ahead. Make for the nearest land. If they could beat Shinano, run her aground on the coast, they might save the ship and the crew. But to reach shore, they had to keep moving. At 4:00 a.m., with the list worsening to 15 degrees, Shinano's engines roared at full throttle, driving the dying carrier forward at 18 knots. But every mile they traveled made things worse. The force of the water rushing past the hull pushed more seawater through the torpedo holes. The faster they went, the faster they sank. It was a race they could not win. Below deck, chaos consumed the ship. Damage control crews scrambled through flooded compartments, trying desperately to shore up bulkheads and seal ruptures. But they were fighting blind. Half the lighting was out. Communication lines were severed, and the corridors were packed with panicking civilians, 300 shipyard workers who had never trained for this, 40 civilian contractors who did not know where the lifeboats were, and dozens of conscripted Korean laborers who could not understand the commands being shouted at them in Japanese. Men stumbled through knee-deep water in the darkness, searching for tools, for pumps, for anything that might stop the flooding. But there was nothing. The equipment was not installed, the hatches were not sealed, and the ocean was unstoppable. In fire room number 3, the water rose so fast that the blast doors jammed before anyone could escape. 18 men drowned in pitch darkness, trapped behind steel walls. In the starboard engine room, engineers fought to restart the flooded machinery, electrocuting themselves on exposed wiring. In the refrigeration plant, frozen food supplies floated past corpses. The ship was becoming a graveyard, one compartment at a time. On the bridge, Captain Abe watched the list grow worse. 16 degrees, 17, 18. At 5:30 a.m., he made a desperate decision. Order the destroyers to take us in tow. If Shinano could not make it to shore under her own power, maybe the escorts could drag her there. The destroyer, Hamikaze, pulled alongside first, her crew firing rope lines across the gap. Sailors aboard Shinano secured the cables to massive bollards on the forward deck. The destroyer's engines strained, pulling with everything she had. For a moment, it seemed to work. The carrier's forward momentum slowed, but then the weight became too much. 71,000 tons of sinking steel was more than any destroyer could handle. The tow cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot, whipping back across Shinano's deck and cutting a sailor in half. The Yokosuka tried next. Same result. The cable held for 3 minutes before parting the backlash, killing 2 more men. By 6:00 a.m., Captain Abe abandoned the attempt. The destroyers could not save them. No one could. Dawn broke over the Pacific at 6:30 a.m., painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it illuminated a nightmare. Shinano was listing 20 degrees now, her starboard side nearly submerged. The ocean lapped at the base of the island superstructure. Men clung to railings on the tilting flight deck, staring at the water rising toward them. In the 5 hours since the torpedo strike, the carrier had traveled barely 36 miles. She was crawling now, her engines sputtering as flooded boiler rooms lost pressure. At 8:00 a.m., Captain Abe made one final desperate gamble: flood the portside boiler rooms. If they deliberately filled compartments on the opposite side of the ship, it might counteract the list level her out, buy them more time. It was madness, intentionally flooding a sinking ship. But Abe had no other options. He gave the order. Engineers opened the seacocks on the port side, letting the ocean pour in. For 10 miraculous minutes it worked. The list stabilized at 18 degrees. Shinano stopped rolling. Men on deck dared to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. And then the starboard hydraulic pump room, already straining under the pressure, flooded completely. The counterbalance was gone. The list resumed worse than before. At 8:30 a.m. in the hydraulic pump room, Lieutenant Inada stood waist-deep in freezing seawater, watching his men drown around him. The pumps were dead. The compartment was sealed. There was no escape. He picked up the voice pipe, the communication tube that connected to the bridge, and spoke his final words. "Captain Abe, this is Lieutenant Inada. The pump room is lost. I go before you. I will pray for Shinano and her crew." And then the water rose over his head, and he was gone. On the bridge, Abe heard the transmission and closed his eyes. Another compartment lost. Another group of men dead. How many more before this was over? By 9:00 a.m., the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The list was 22 degrees and accelerating. Seawater was now flooding the portside boiler rooms faster than they had planned, throwing off the entire balance. The ship was rolling uncontrollably. Below deck, men were trapped as passageways became too steep to climb. Ladders turned into vertical walls. Doors jammed from the pressure. The lower decks were abandoned, left to the ocean. At 10:00 a.m., over 1,000 men were crowded onto the flight deck, the only safe place left on the ship. They clung to aircraft tie-down points, to cables, to anything bolted to the deck, as Shinano rolled beneath them. The ocean was just feet away now, lapping at the edge of the flight deck. Some men prayed. Others wept. A few simply stared in numb disbelief. This was the largest aircraft carrier ever built. This was the ship that was supposed to save Japan. And she was dying after just 10 days of life. On the bridge, Captain Abe stood alone, surrounded by his senior officers. They all knew what was coming. There was no saving the ship now. The only question was how many men they could save. But Abe could not bring himself to say the words. Abandon ship. To give that order was to admit defeat, to acknowledge that the pride of Japan's navy was going to the bottom. So instead he turned to his crew and said simply, "You are all released from duty. Save yourselves." It was 10:30 a.m. Shinano had 25 minutes left. Men began jumping from the flight deck into the ocean, some with life jackets, most without. The water was cold, the waves high. Those who could swim struck out toward the destroyers circling nearby. Those who could not simply floated, hoping someone would pull them aboard. But rescue was not guaranteed. On the destroyer, Yukikaze Captain Terauchi watched the men in the water and gave an order that would stain his name forever. "Lieutenant," he said to his executive officer, "do not pick up any sailor who cries or calls for help. Such faint hearts are of no use to the Navy. Rescue only those who stay calm and courageous. It was an insane command, a death sentence for hundreds of men. But the executive officer obeyed. As the destroyer circled through the floating debris, sailors on deck threw ropes only to those men who remained silent, who did not beg, who did not scream. Those who panicked, who cried for their mothers, who pleaded for rescue, were left to drown. It was cruelty disguised as discipline. By 10:55 a.m., Shinano could fight no longer. The list reached 30 degrees. The starboard side was completely underwater. The flight deck, once a symbol of Japan's naval might, was tilted like a sinking playground slide. And then, with a groan of tortured metal that echoed across the ocean, the massive carrier rolled onto her side. Trapped air pockets inside the hull exploded upward, creating massive bubbles that burst on the surface with sounds like artillery shells. The suction pulled men underwater, dragging them into the ship's final plunge. Shinano slid beneath the waves, stern first, her massive propellers still turning uselessly in the air before vanishing into the depths. Captain Abe stood on the bridge until the very end, his hands resting on the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He did not jump. He did not swim. He simply went down with his ship, along with most of his senior officers. They had failed. And in the Imperial Japanese Navy, failure was unforgivable. By 11:00 a.m., the largest aircraft carrier ever built was gone. In her place was only debris, oil slicks, and bodies. The destroyers circled for hours, pulling survivors from the water. But the rescue was slow, deliberate, selective. By 2:00 p.m., the search was called off. Of the 2,515 people who had sailed aboard Shinano just 19 hours earlier, only 160 survived. 455 men were dead, drowned, crushed, sucked into the depths. The loss was staggering, not just in numbers, but in symbolism. Japan's hope, her secret weapon, her floating fortress, had lasted 10 days. 200 miles away, the USS Archerfish surfaced cautiously, scanning for enemy planes. Commander Enright stood on the bridge, exhausted but alive. His crew had heard the distant explosions through the hull, the sounds of a ship breaking apart. But they had not stayed to watch. Survival was more important than confirmation. The submarine turned south, running on the surface at full speed, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the kill zone. By December 15, 1944, Archerfish pulled into Guam, her patrol complete. Enright expected a hero's welcome. Instead, he was met with skepticism. The operations officer, Commander John Corbus, pulled him aside in private. "I am sorry, Joe," he said quietly, "but naval intelligence will not back your claim. They say there was not any carrier in Tokyo Bay that night. So how could you have sunk one?" Enright was stunned. He had fired 6 torpedoes. He had heard 4 explosions. His crew had logged the entire engagement. And now they were calling him a liar. Enright handed over his patrol report, including the pencil sketch he had drawn during the chase. One detail stood out: a rounded bow unlike any American carrier design. It matched rumors of a secret Japanese supercarrier, a ship so classified that even Allied intelligence was not sure it existed. And then, 3 weeks later, confirmation arrived. American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese naval transmission. Shinano sunk. Position confirmed. Date confirmed. The largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine in history. Naval analysts estimated her displacement at 71,000 tons, dwarfing every previous submarine kill. Enright's mission was declared the most successful submarine patrol of the war by tonnage sunk. For his actions, he received the Navy Cross. The man who had once stepped down in shame was now a legend. But the story was far from over. Because in Japan, the loss of Shinano sent shockwaves through the Imperial Navy that would change the course of the war, and the secrets surrounding her death were only beginning to surface. In Part 3, we will see how Japan tried desperately to cover up the disaster, how survivors were silenced, how the Navy scrambled to prevent the same tragedy from happening again, and how one final desperate gamble would lead to an even greater catastrophe. The sinking of Shinano was not the end. It was only the beginning of Japan's final collapse. Commander Enright fired 6 torpedoes into the darkness. 4 hit their target. The largest aircraft carrier ever built sank in 7 hours. 455 men died. Japan's secret weapon, her symbol of hope, vanished beneath the Pacific after just 10 days of service. The Imperial Navy tried to cover it up, silencing survivors hiding the truth. But the damage was done. American submarines now knew they could kill anything Japan put in the water. And across the Pacific, in bunkers and command centers from Tokyo to Singapore, Japanese admirals stared at maps and realized a terrifying truth. If one submarine could destroy Shinano, no ship was safe. The war had changed, and Japan was running out of time. Because what happened next was not just about one sunken carrier. It was about the collapse of an entire naval strategy, the unraveling of Japan's final defense, and the desperate, brutal endgame that would cost tens of thousands more lives before the sun finally set on the empire. The news of Shinano's sinking reached Tokyo within hours, transmitted in coded bursts from the destroyer Yukikaze. At Imperial Naval Headquarters, staff officers gathered in stunned silence as the report was read aloud. The carrier had been sunk, the largest warship Japan had ever built, destroyed by a single American submarine. Impossible. But the casualty lists confirmed it. 455 dead. The ship at the bottom of the ocean. The psychological impact was devastating. If Shinano, with her massive displacement, her anti-torpedo bulges, her armor could not survive 4 torpedo hits, what could? The Yamato. The Nagato. Every remaining capital ship suddenly seemed vulnerable. Within 24 hours, the Naval General Staff issued Emergency Directive 447. All major warships were ordered to increase their anti-submarine escorts. Zigzag patterns were to be more aggressive. No capital ship would sail at night without air cover. Training for damage control crews was intensified. But these were desperate measures, reactions to a threat they had underestimated for too long. American submarines were hunting with terrifying efficiency. In November 1944, alone, U.S. subs sank 38 Japanese merchant ships and 4 warships. In December, the numbers climbed to 41 merchants and 6 warships. Japan's oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had dropped by 60% compared to 1943. Without fuel, the combined fleet could barely operate. Shinano's loss was not just symbolic, it was strategic. The carrier was supposed to spearhead a new defensive doctrine, using aircraft to protect convoys and hunt American submarines. Now that plan was gone. Japan's submarine defense relied on aging destroyers, inexperienced pilots, and wishful thinking. And the Americans knew it. The U.S. Pacific Fleet Submarine Command studied the Archerfish patrol report with intense interest. Commander Enright's shallow torpedo settings had worked perfectly. His decision to aim just beneath the waterline, targeting the thin armor of a carrier's upper hull, had proven devastatingly effective. Within weeks, new tactical orders went out to every American submarine in the Pacific. When engaging large warships, set torpedoes shallow. Aim high. Go for the flight deck weight on carriers. Go for the superstructure on battleships. Make them top-heavy. Make them roll. The doctrine spread like wildfire. By January 1945, Japanese naval intelligence began intercepting alarming reports. American submarines were becoming more aggressive, striking closer to home waters, penetrating defensive perimeters that were supposed to be secure. On January 12th, the submarine USS Gurnard sank the escort carrier Unyo off the coast of China. 2 torpedoes, both shallow hits. The carrier went down in 40 minutes. On January 23rd, USS Pomfret torpedoed the escort carrier Kaio, crippling her so badly she never sailed again. On February 17th, USS Batfish sank 3 Japanese submarines in 76 hours, a record that still stands. Japan's anti-submarine forces, already stretched thin, were collapsing. The Imperial Navy could not protect its own submarines anymore. But the crisis went beyond tactics. There was a deeper problem festering inside Japan's naval establishment. A problem of arrogance, of rigid thinking, of refusing to adapt. And that problem was about to explode into full view. Captain Toshio Abe was dead drowned with his ship. But the survivors of Shinano were not allowed to rest. Within days of the sinking, naval intelligence officers arrived at the hospital in Kure, where the rescued sailors were recovering. The interrogations were brutal. What happened? Why did the ship sink so fast? Who failed to secure the watertight doors? Who authorized sailing with incomplete systems? The survivors, traumatized and grieving, told the truth. The ship was not ready. Captain Abe had protested. The orders came from Tokyo. It was the Naval General Staff that forced Shinano to sail before she was completed. That was not the answer the interrogators wanted to hear. Within a week, a scapegoat was found. Commander Mikami, the chief damage control officer who had survived the sinking, was arrested and charged with negligence. The official report blamed him for failing to properly seal bulkheads, for not training his crews adequately for the chaos below deck that prevented effective flooding response. It was a lie. Mikami had filed 17 separate reports warning that the damage control systems were incomplete. He had begged for more time. But the Navy needed someone to blame, and a mid-level officer was easier to sacrifice than admitting the truth, that the sinking was the fault of the High Command. The cover-up extended further. Survivors were ordered to sign statements swearing they would never speak of the sinking. They were transferred to remote bases scattered across the empire, kept away from journalists and foreign observers. The official story was that Shinano had been damaged by air attack and was being repaired. For months, Japanese newspapers continued to print articles about the mighty new carrier that would soon terrorize American fleets. The lie held until March 1945, when American intelligence publicly announced the sinking, releasing intercepted radio transmissions as proof. The embarrassment was total, but by then, Japan had bigger problems. Because the lesson of Shinano, that large surface ships were death traps in submarine-infested waters, was being learned the hard way across the entire fleet. On April 7, 1945, the consequences of ignoring that lesson became catastrophically clear. The Imperial Navy launched Operation Ten-Go, a suicide mission disguised as a glorious last stand. The battleship Yamato, Shinano's sister ship, was sent on a one-way trip to Okinawa with orders to beach herself and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. She carried just enough fuel for a one-way journey. No air cover was provided. The mission was insane from the start. American submarines detected Yamato almost immediately after she left port. USS Threadfin shadowed her throughout the night, transmitting position reports every hour. By dawn, U.S. Navy aircraft carriers had launched nearly 400 planes. The attack began at 12:30 p.m. Yamato was hit by at least 12 torpedoes and 7 bombs. She rolled over and exploded at 2:23 p.m., taking 498 men with her. Only 269 survived. It was Shinano all over again, but worse. A massive warship sent to sea unprepared with inadequate escorts on a mission that was doomed before it began. Japan had learned nothing. But while Japan's surface fleet was dying, something unexpected was happening beneath the waves. American submarine crews, emboldened by their successes, were pushing deeper into Japanese waters, taking risks that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. And that aggression was about to deliver the most devastating blow yet. On July 30th, 1945, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis completed a secret mission delivering components for the atomic bomb to Tinian Island. On her return voyage, sailing alone without escorts, she was torpedoed by the Japanese submarine I-58. She sank in 12 minutes. Of the 196 men aboard, only 316 survived, most dying of exposure, dehydration, and shark attacks over the following 4 days. It was the U.S. Navy's worst loss at sea in World War II. But the irony was brutal. The ship that carried the weapon that would end the war was destroyed by one of the last effective Japanese submarines still operating. By August 1945, Japan's navy was finished. Of the 686 warships that had existed in December 1941, fewer than 50 were still operational. The rest were sunk, scuttled, or rusting in port without fuel to move them. But the story of Shinano's sinking had one final chapter 1 that would not be revealed until decades later. In the chaos of Japan's surrender, thousands of documents were destroyed to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. Among them were the complete design specifications for Shinano, the after-action reports from the sinking, and the interrogation transcripts of the survivors. The truth about what really happened that night in November 1944 was buried. It was not until the 1970s, when American and Japanese naval historians began comparing notes, that the full picture emerged. Shinano had not been sunk because American torpedoes were superior. She had been sunk because she was sent to sea unfinished, rushed into service by commanders more concerned with propaganda than preparation. The same institutional arrogance that had led Japan to attack Pearl Harbor, believing they could win a quick victory before America's industrial might could respond, had killed Shinano. The Imperial Navy had spent years building the largest, most powerful warships in the world, but they forgot the most important lesson: that wars are not won by the biggest guns or the thickest armor. They are won by logistics, by preparation, by leaders willing to admit mistakes and adapt. Commander Enright returned to the United States in 1945 as a hero. He was promoted to captain and awarded the Navy Cross. But he rarely spoke about the Shinano. When reporters asked him how it felt to sink the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine, he would shrug and say, "I just did my job." His crew knew better. They had watched him agonize over the firing solution, checking and rechecking the math, terrified of failing again, like he had with the Shokaku. They had seen him collapse in exhaustion after the attack, his hands shaking as the depth charges exploded around them. Enright had redeemed himself. But the cost of that redemption, when 455 Japanese sailors drowned, weighed on him for the rest of his life. He retired from the Navy in 1963 and died in 1992, taking most of his memories to the grave. His shipmates remembered him as a quiet man, a competent officer, someone who had been given a second chance and refused to waste it. In Japan, the memory of Shinano faded quickly. The country had too many tragedies to mourn, too many lost ships and dead sailors to remember them all individually. But for naval architects and strategists, Shinano became a case study in failure. Modern warship design incorporates lessons learned directly from her sinking. Damage control systems are tested exhaustively before commissioning. Watertight integrity is verified at every stage of construction. Crews train for months on flooding scenarios before ever leaving port. The regulations exist because 455 men died when those precautions were ignored. In 2005, a Japanese deep-sea research vessel located the wreck of Shinano, lying upright on the ocean floor at a depth of over 4,000 meters. The images showed a ship largely intact, her massive hull still imposing even in death. But the torpedo damage was clearly visible. 4 holes punched high in the starboard side, exactly where Commander Enright had aimed. The flight deck had collapsed inward, crushed by its own weight, as the carrier rolled over. It was a tomb, and it would remain that way forever. The sinking of Shinano marked a turning point in naval warfare that extended far beyond World War II. It proved that no ship, regardless of size or armor, was invincible. It demonstrated that submarines had evolved from nuisance raiders into capital ship killers, and it showed that institutional arrogance, the belief that tradition and reputation could substitute for proper preparation, was a fatal weakness. In the decades that followed, the lessons of Shinano would influence the design of every major warship, from the American supercarriers of the Cold War to the modern guided missile destroyers patrolling the seas today. But the human cost of those lessons, the 455 men who drowned in the darkness, is often forgotten. They were sailors doing their duty, following orders, trusting that their leaders had prepared them for the mission ahead. That trust was betrayed, and they paid for it with their lives. In Part 4, we will explore the final legacy of Shinano. What happened to the survivors who were silenced? How did the sinking influence post-war naval doctrine? And what can we learn today from the disaster that changed naval warfare forever? The story is not over yet. From a disgraced submarine commander who voluntarily stepped down in shame to the man who sank the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine in history. Commander Joseph Enright fired 6 torpedoes on a moonlit November night in 1944. 4 hit. Shinano, the pride of Japan's Navy, went to the bottom in 7 hours, taking 455 men with her. The sinking changed submarine warfare forever, proving that no ship was truly unsinkable. American subs became capital ship hunters. Japan's surface fleet collapsed. The war in the Pacific accelerated toward its brutal conclusion. But here is the twist nobody talks about. The man who achieved the impossible, who redeemed himself in the most spectacular way imaginable, spent the rest of his life haunted by what he had done. Because success in war always comes with a price, and sometimes that price is paid long after the guns fall silent. Commander Joseph Enright returned to Pearl Harbor on December 15, 1944, expecting validation. Instead, he got skepticism. Naval intelligence refused to confirm his kill. There was no carrier in Tokyo Bay that night, they said. You must have hit a tanker, maybe a transport. Enright was devastated. He had risked everything for that shot. His crew had threaded through a destroyer screen fired at point-blank range, heard the explosions, felt the depth charges. And now headquarters was calling him a liar. For 3 agonizing weeks, Enright waited while intelligence analysts debated his claim. Then, in early January 1945, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese naval communications. Shinano sunk. Position confirmed. The largest aircraft carrier ever built. Destroyed by USS Archerfish. The confirmation came through official channels, and suddenly everything changed. Enright was promoted to captain. He received the Navy Cross, one of the highest decorations for valor. His patrol was declared the most successful submarine mission of the entire war, by tonnage sunk. Newspapers ran stories about the small-town boy from North Dakota who became a naval legend. But Enright did not feel like a hero. In interviews after the war, Enright rarely spoke about the Shinano. When pressed, he would give brief technical answers. We set the torpedoes shallow. We aimed for the waterline. We got lucky. But his crew knew the truth. They had watched him obsess over the firing solution, checking the math again and again, terrified of missing, like he had missed the Shokaku a year earlier. They had seen him collapse in exhaustion after the attack, his hands shaking uncontrollably as depth charges exploded around their submarine. They knew that sinking Shinano had not erased his earlier failure. It had simply replaced one set of nightmares with another. Because now, instead of dreaming about the carrier that got away, Enright dreamed about the 455 men he had sent to the bottom. He never said it publicly, but his family later revealed that he struggled with what we now call survivor's guilt. He had done his job perfectly. He had followed orders. He had saved American lives by removing a Japanese carrier from the war. But the cost, over 1,000 enemy sailors drowned, weighed on him until the day he died. Enright retired from the Navy in 1963 after a distinguished career. He served in Korea, trained new submarine commanders, helped develop post-war naval doctrine. But he avoided reunions with his Archerfish crew. He declined interviews about the Shinano sinking. When the Navy tried to organize a commemoration for the 25th anniversary of the kill, Enright politely refused to attend. He wanted to forget. In 1992, Joseph Enright died at the age of 81 in a nursing home in Maryland. His obituary mentioned the Shinano sinking in passing, as if it were just one accomplishment among many. But the veterans who attended his funeral knew better. They knew that one night in November 1944 had defined him, shaped him, haunted him for nearly 50 years. And they knew that the man who achieved the impossible had paid for it in ways the medals and promotions could never compensate for. The other key figures in the story met varied fates. Captain Toshio Abe drowned with his ship going down on the bridge as Shinano rolled over. He was posthumously promoted, a hollow honor for a man whose warnings had been ignored. Commander Mikami, the damage control officer who survived, was court-martialed and convicted of negligence, a scapegoat for the Navy's institutional failures. He spent 2 years in military prison before being quietly released after the war ended. The destroyer captain who ordered his men to rescue only those who remained calm and silent was never punished. He retired with honors. But the legacy of what happened that night extended far beyond individual fates, because the tactical lessons learned from Shinano's sinking would reshape submarine warfare for generations. Within months of the Archerfish patrol report being circulated, every American submarine in the Pacific adopted Enright's shallow torpedo settings. The results were immediate and devastating. In the final 9 months of the war, U.S. submarines sank 43 Japanese warships and over 600 merchant vessels. Japan's oil imports dropped to nearly zero. Her fleet could not move. Her armies could not be supplied. The empire starved. And while no single submarine ever matched the Archerfish's tonnage record, the cumulative impact was staggering. American submarines sank approximately 1,300 Japanese ships during World War II, totaling over 5.3 million tons. They destroyed 30% of Japan's combat vessels and 60% of her merchant fleet. Submarine warfare, once considered a supporting role, had become one of the primary instruments of victory in the Pacific. After the war, the shallow torpedo doctrine spread to other navies. The British Royal Navy adopted it. The Soviet Navy studied it extensively. When NATO began standardizing submarine tactics in the 1950s, the lessons from Shinano were incorporated into training manuals. Target the weak points. Aim high. Make large ships unstable. The principles remained relevant even as technology evolved. Modern submarines use wire-guided torpedoes and advanced sonar, but the fundamental tactics get close, aim carefully, exploit vulnerabilities are still taught at naval academies today. The wreck of Shinano itself became a subject of intense interest. For decades, her exact location remained unknown. Japanese records were vague, American navigation data was classified. But in 2005, a Japanese deep-sea research vessel located the wreck lying upright on the ocean floor at a depth of 200 meters. The images revealed a ship remarkably intact, despite 6 decades underwater. Her massive hull was still whole. The flight deck had collapsed inward, crushed by its own weight, and the 4 torpedo holes were clearly visible on the starboard side, exactly where Enright had aimed them. The discovery allowed naval architects to study the damage in detail, confirming what had long been suspected. Shinano had not been destroyed because American torpedoes were superior. She had been destroyed because she was incomplete, rushed into service with critical systems unfinished. That realization led to sweeping changes in how navies commission new warships. Modern naval construction incorporates exhaustive testing protocols that exist directly because of Shinano's failure. Watertight integrity is verified at every stage of construction, not just inspected at the end. Damage control systems are tested under simulated combat conditions before the ship ever leaves port. Crews train for months on flooding scenarios, learning to seal. Bulkheads manage counter-flooding, maintain stability under extreme conditions. The regulations are written in blood, the blood of 1 to 455 Japanese sailors who drowned because someone in Tokyo decided propaganda was more important than preparation. These lessons extended beyond military shipbuilding. The commercial shipping industry adopted many of the same safety protocols. Modern cruise ships, oil tankers, and container vessels all incorporate design features influenced by the Shinano disaster. Redundant pumping systems, multiple watertight compartments, emergency power that can operate independently. The ghost of Shinano haunts every modern shipyard, a reminder that cutting corners in the name of speed or cost can lead to catastrophic failure. But the largest legacy was not about technology or tactics. It was about institutional culture, about how organizations respond to innovation and dissent. Captain Abe had warned his superiors that Shinano was not ready. He filed formal protests. He documented every incomplete system, every missing door, every inoperable pump. And he was ignored. The Naval General Staff wanted the carrier at sea immediately, consequences be damned. Abe followed orders, and it killed him along with over 1,000 of his men. That pattern, competent professionals, overruled by distant bureaucrats, has repeated throughout history. The Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986 happened because engineers who warned about O-ring failures in cold weather were ignored by managers focused on launch schedules. The 2008 financial crisis was exacerbated by risk analysts whose warnings about subprime mortgages were dismissed by executives chasing short-term profits. The COVID-19 pandemic was worsened in many countries by public health experts whose recommendations were overridden by political leaders. The fundamental problem remains the same. People in positions of power often value appearances, deadlines, and political considerations over technical reality and expert warnings. And when that happens, people die. The story of Shinano teaches us that innovation and competence are not enough. Commander Enright was competent. He calculated his firing solution perfectly, executed his attack flawlessly, and achieved an impossible kill. But his competence came at the cost of 1,455 lives. Captain Abe was competent. He recognized his ship's vulnerabilities, reported them accurately, and fought to save his vessel until the end. But his competence was negated by a system that valued propaganda over preparation. Competence without institutional support is often futile, and institutions that ignore competence tend to fail catastrophically. This dynamic appears repeatedly in military history. The French Army in 1940 had competent tank commanders who understood mobile warfare, but their innovations were suppressed by a general staff committed to static defense. Result: France fell in 6 weeks. The Soviet military in 1941 had competent intelligence officers who accurately predicted the German invasion, but Stalin ignored their reports. Result: millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the first months of Operation Barbarossa. The U.S. military in Vietnam had competent field commanders who recognized the limitations of conventional tactics against guerrilla forces, but their concerns were overruled by politicians in Washington fixated on body counts. Result: a war that dragged on for years and cost tens of thousands of American lives. The lesson is clear. Listen to the people doing the work. Pay attention to the experts on the ground. When someone with technical knowledge raises a red flag, investigate rather than dismiss. Because the alternative is disaster, and yet we keep making the same mistakes. Which brings us to the final revelation, the detail almost nobody knows. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, the U.S. Navy conducted a secret investigation into why Shinano had sunk so quickly from just 4 torpedo hits. The report, classified for decades and finally released in 1998, contained a shocking conclusion. The American Mark 14 torpedoes that sank Shinano were actually defective. They were part of a batch that had faulty depth control mechanisms, causing them to run shallower than their settings indicated. In other words, when Enright set his torpedoes to run at 10 feet deep, they actually ran at about 5 to 7 feet far shallower than intended. It was a malfunction and accident. But it turned out to be exactly the right depth to exploit Shinano's weak upper hull armor. Enright had not outsmarted the Japanese through brilliant tactics. He had gotten lucky because his weapons were broken in just the right way. The Navy buried this finding for 50 years. They could not admit that one of the greatest submarine victories in history had been achieved partly through equipment failure. It would undermine confidence in American torpedoes, which had already suffered from reliability problems early in the war. So they let the legend stand. Enright, the genius submarine commander who calculated the perfect firing solution. The man who redeemed himself through skill and determination. And to be fair, Enright did make brilliant decisions. He chose to shadow the carrier despite losing visual contact. He predicted Abe's course change correctly. He maneuvered through a destroyer screen in darkness. He aimed at the right part of the ship. His competence was real. But the killing blow came from faulty torpedoes running at an unintended depth. Success is often a combination of skill and luck, and sometimes we never know which one mattered more. From a disgraced submarine commander with a second chance to the man who sank the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. From a Japanese carrier rushed to sea unfinished to 455 men drowned because bureaucrats ignored expert warnings. Joseph Enright proved that redemption is possible, that failure does not have to be permanent. But he also proved that success in war comes with a price that medals cannot repay. Captain Abe proved that competence without institutional support is often futile, that doing your job perfectly still might not be enough. Together, their stories teach us the most important lesson of all. That technology tactics and innovation matter far less than the institutions and cultures that deploy them. That listening to experts respecting technical reality and valuing preparation over propaganda are not optional. They are the difference between victory and disaster, between 1060 survivors and 455 dead, between a ship that serves for decades and one that sinks in 7 hours. The Shinano lies 200 meters below the Pacific, a tomb for those who trusted their leaders to prepare them properly. Commander Enright rests in a cemetery in Maryland, his nightmares finally silent. And somewhere between those two graves lies the truth. That the courage to try, the humility to listen, and the wisdom to prepare are worth more than the largest warship ever built.